Hey everyone, welcome back to the Fantasy Writers Toolshed. This is JM. I'm here with Richie Billing, and we've got a down and dirty mini episode for you. How you doing, Richie?
Yeah, not too bad. Yeah, looking forward to getting down and dirty.
I don't know how I should take that. So we've done a lot of bigger issue topics in the past. We've talked about things like world building and cliches, like these overarching fantasy issues. And we've also talked about the industry. So we've talked about working with editors and working with cover artists. We haven't really talked about the actual mechanics of writing before. So for today, we're just going to do a very short dive into the mechanics of dialogue in fiction. And this applies to fantasy fiction or any other fiction you're writing. And I'm kind of coming at this as an editor. So recently, I've taken on a more powerful role as an editor. I've been reviewing a lot of books that people have sent me and things like that. And I just have seen a lot of common issues with dialogue, the way that it's used, the way that it's formatting. So I just wanted to take a quick, 10 minutes to dive into some of the common, fine-tuned issues that you might find in your own manuscript regarding your dialogue and how you can fix them.
Yeah, most definitely. It's one of them things, dialogue, that you can often take it for granted, but if it's done badly, it can ruin your story. At the same time, if it's done very well, it can make your story. People can often remember stories for the quality dialogue, the fantastic conversations between characters. So it's important to spend a bit of time learning how to get the most out of it and how importantly to use it.
It's like you said, I would say it's critical to genre fiction, which is character centric. So fantasy is very character centric. Dialogue is where you develop the voices of your characters. You develop their idiosyncrasies that make the reader like those characters. I don't think I would be hard pressed to say you could find a book that doesn't have any dialogue in it.
I think it's even short stories, I think, need a bit of dialogue, even if it's just like one or two characters. It's just, there has to be some sort of dialogue, I think. Otherwise, the stories, one of the main functions of dialogue is that it really increases the speed of the pace of the story. So if you've got no dialogue, the pace can be quite slow and monotonous.
So just diving right into the topic, when to use dialogue and why. And we've talked about this before in one of our first episodes when we talked about world building. We talked about how you can use dialogue for world building. You can bring in backstory. You can bring in ideas about the setting, and it's not a brick over the head that exposition can be. The caveat to that is, and here's the big tip from the editor's perspective, here's my warning. Dialogue should always be natural to the characters. So you should not be putting words in the mouths of the characters in order to fulfill a function such as world building. You don't want characters to be talking about things that they wouldn't normally talk about, or discussing something that they both already know and they wouldn't be talking about just to fill the reader in. It's a delicate balance of how do you use dialogue to do backstory and world building without it feeling unnatural. And then actually a couple of days ago I was watching The Mummy, the movie I think is from 1997, and that movie has a really good scene where they use dialogue to develop backstory. The woman character who's the Egyptologist and the librarian, the first scene you get of her, she knocks all of the bookcases down in the library, and then her boss comes out huffing and puffing. And so that scene, you're first introduced to that character and her idiosyncrasies through showing, through an
Yeah.
action. She's clumsy. She's, inattentive. Okay, we've got that absent-minded professor vibe from her. And then the dialogue starts, and the way that they justify her talking about her academic background is her boss storms in and says, what have you done? Why do I even keep you here? And then she has to defend herself. So she says, well, I have like a PhD in Egyptology, and I'm the only one that can read hieroglyphics. And she lists out all of her unique skills.
Yeah.
And in any other setting, that would come off extremely forced. But in that particular situation, it was justified because that character needed to defend herself, and it was a completely natural reaction. And when I saw that, I was like, that is a good use of dialogue as world building and backstory, because it's natural to the characters.
Yeah, great point.
Any thoughts on that, Richie?
No, I agree entirely with what you said there. One of the biggest risks, I think, especially with fantasy, is info dumping in dialogue, and there's nothing worse, especially like the example you gave there of like the forced way in which information is delivered. It's just you pick it up immediately as a reader and you switch off straight away because it's not natural. Like you say, the reader should be the fly on the wall when it comes to conversations. They should be observing a natural conversation between two characters. I think they call it maid and butler dialogue. Is that right? That's something you've heard before, Tim?
What's that?
Maid and butler dialogue. Have you heard that phrase before? I think it was. I think I heard Brandon Sanderson use it first. And I think it's basically that you're overhearing the conversation between the maid and the butler. They know the ins and outs of what's going on, so they're not going to start going into unnecessary backstory, detail over something that they already know. It's up to the reader then to sort of ascertain what they're talking about and make connections, and I think that makes it more interesting as well.
Yeah.
If you're just told everything that's happening, like part of the joy of reading is taking little pieces and putting them together and working out what's going to happen. So, yeah.
Yep. So moving on from there, putting on my editor hat again. Another big thing is formatting and punctuation in dialogue, and I see a lot of that repeatedly with very seasoned authors. For whatever reason, dialogue punctuation and formatting just is a complicated beast, I guess, and it troubles a lot of authors. And I'm not going to get into, use quotation marks, and if you're British, you use one mark, and if you're American, you use 2 marks, and then if you're quoting something inside the dialogue, you use the opposite and you use a comma. Like, I'm not going to get into all that. You should all know that. We learned it in elementary school. I'm going to get into the more complicated bits. So for example, when do you use a comma and at the end of a piece of dialogue, and when do you use a period? And this is a very, very common problem. So if you have a character saying a phrase, so like, look over there. If you're following that with a dialogue tag, such as said or yelled or something along those lines, then you use a comma. The comma goes inside of the quotation marks. So it would be, look over there, comma, quotation mark, he said.
Yeah.
If you're following that with an action, then the dialogue ends with a period and you start a new sentence. So look over there, period, quotation mark, he pointed at the battlements, something like that.
Yeah.
So an action is not a dialogue tag, and it is not formatted like a dialogue tag. And things that a lot of people get confused about what is a dialogue tag. And we'll get into those a little bit later. But bottom line is, if you're following the the quotation with an action, you use a period inside the quotation. And if you're following it with a dialogue tag, you use a comma. So that's
Yeah.
basic, but a lot of people get confused about that. Second one is the difference between a dash and ellipses. So ellipses are the 3 periods that mark a pause or a slow cutoff. In dialogue, if your speaker is slowly trailing off, like they're getting distracted, or they're just not completing the thought, then you use ellipses. So 3 periods. So like, well, I thought once, and it's just trailing off. That would end with 3 periods, or 3 full stops in British, I guess. And that marks a slow trailing off. If your speaker is being interrupted, then you'd use a long dash. So, well, I think he got punched in the mouth. That's going to be a dash. That dash marks a sudden break in the speech. Whereas the ellipses marks a gradual break in the speech, or a trail off. And that's an important caveat to note. And then also, if you're breaking the speech with an action in between, you can use commas. So, for example, someday he's going to get hit, comma, he said, but I won't be there to see it. But it's better if you're going to put an action in there that's separate from the speech, to use dashes. So someday he's going to get hit, quotation mark, dash, his voice turned huffy and he looked away, quotation mark, but I won't be there to see it. So if the action is unrelated to the actual speech, so it's not a dialogue tag, or it's not even tone of voice, something like pointing, sitting down, picking something up, turning away, then you want to isolate that with dashes, and those dashes all fall outside of the quotation marks. That's a big one that a lot of people don't understand, how to use dashes to set off action with dialogue. That's probably one of the most complicated things to do with dialogue. Any other basic formatting things that you've noticed, Richie?
No, I think you've pretty much covered all the main ones. I mean, I think you briefly touched upon said. Like, a lot of people ask, should you use said? Should you use other kinds of saidisms? But one thing Brandon Sanderson said, which stuck with me, is that readers don't care about these words. They just want to know who's talking, so they basically skip words like said and asked and look for the character name. So using said a lot, it doesn't make a difference. Most of the time, readers just skip over them.
So that's jumping right into our next topic. Like the word that you used, saidisms, is a common term for these, and those are things like blurted, screamed, hissed, all those different creative ways of saying said. And generally speaking, you want to avoid creative dialogue tags. So these are dialogue tags. He said, she said, he yelled, he whispered, he blurted, he scoffed. Like, stick to said, asked, the occasional yell, and avoid the rest as much as possible. And like you said, when you use a basic dialogue like said or ask, the reader just skips through it. All they're looking for is the identity of the speaker, not the mannerisms. The mannerisms should come out in the dialogue itself, in the speech. The way that you write the words that are being spoken should convey some sense of how they are being spoken. If you do need to draw attention to the manner in which something is being spoken, for example, if it's being whispered, then the occasional whisper or yell or something along those lines. I've used hiss a couple times. just because I really wanted to highlight that particular manner of speaking. But it should be a very rare occurrence because it draws your reader out of the speech and to the action of speaking. And if that's what you want to do, then you can do that.
Yeah.
The other thing about set-isms is laughed is not a said. You cannot laugh out words. You cannot belch out words.
Yeah.
There's a bunch of actions that new authors use in place of said as a dialogue tag that are not dialogue tags. So you cannot smile out words. You can smile, but you can't smile dialogue. You can't laugh dialogue. You can't belch dialogue. Those are actions, and as I previously mentioned, those need to be separated with a period in a new sentence. So, the girl talking to a boy, I really like you. She beamed. That is, I really liked you, period. She beamed as a new sentence. It is not a dialogue tag. Or she smiled. Or that's really funny. She laughed. That's really funny, period, quotation mark, she laughed as a new sentence. Don't confuse actions with dialogue tags. They are different and they need to be formatted differently.
Yeah. Nice.
And then just rolling off of dialogue tags, when do you need them and when do you don't? You don't always have to have a dialogue tag with every portion of speech. And this is kind of going to get into the last topic where we're paragraphing. So when you only have two speakers, you need to have dialogue tags to introduce the speakers. But if they're just going back and forth, asking each other questions or commenting off of each other, there comes a point where you can drop the dialogue tags. And the way that you identify the speakers is through paragraphing. Each speaker, every time you change a speaker, you should build a new paragraph. You drop down to a new paragraph. And that identifies to the reader that there's a new person speaking. And then you don't have to have dialogue tags. But if this is going on, for a page or 2 pages, what you can do is you have a couple exchanges. So the first exchange, blah, 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 he said, blah, 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 she asked, blah, 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 he replied. And then from then on, you don't need to use dialogue tags. You can just have the dialogue back and forth paragraphed.
Yeah.
And then to keep the reader focused on who's on that pattern, and so they don't lose trace of who's speaking, you can add in actions and other things within those paragraphs to identify the speakers with action and with other things that they're doing, or the occasional dialogue tag. You can't go 2 pages straight without dialogue tags or identifying information. That would be impossible to follow. So every 2 or 3 exchanges, you can add in another identifying feature like an action or a dialogue tag, just to keep the reader focused on who's speaking. But you can cut out 60% of the dialogue tags if you paragraph it right.
Yeah. I think at the end of the day, clarity is king or queen. And that's what you need. You need to make things as clear as possible to your reader. If people are struggling to work out who's speaking, then you haven't done a good enough job. You need to make it as clear as possible.
And that goes for using pronouns as well, which is it's not dialogue specific, but make sure if you're using pronouns that it's clear who the referent of the pronoun is. If you've got two male characters in a dialogue and you drop the word he, it might not be clear who the he is among those two.
Yeah.
And then just moving on to one last bit on formatting. It doesn't come up very much, and because it's not very common, it throws new writers for a loop when they get to it. If you have one speaker who's kind of giving a monologue, so you've got Hamlet and he's just rambling, and you've got multiple paragraphs of dialogue from the same speaker, there's a specific way that you format that. And the way you
Yeah.
format that is the first paragraph doesn't have end quotations. The
Yeah.
second paragraph has open quotations, and that continues until you're finished. So if you have let's say you have 4 paragraphs of dialogue and it's all the same speaker, then
Yeah.
the first paragraph has open quotations, no end quotations. The second paragraph has open quotations, no end quotations. The third paragraph has open quotations, no end quotations. And then the last paragraph has open quotations and end quotations. So the end
Yeah.
quotations mark when that speaker has finished everything that they've had to say. And that's just something it's not something you really think about that much, but it does come up from time to time.
It's quite a
And
subtle one as well, because you wouldn't most of the time even notice that the paragraphs don't have the speech marks at the end of them. But when you're reading it, it flows nicely when the character's talking like that. So
and then
it's a great little tip.
part of it is identifying, keeping clarity and identifying the speaker. That usually when you're formatting this way, you don't have dialogue tags because you haven't closed the speech. So there's no dialogue tags, there's no action, it's just speech. So just keeping track of who the speaker is, you can see that, oh, there's no end quotations in this paragraph. It's the same person in the next paragraph.
Yeah.
So that's about all I got for the main problems that I see day to day when I'm doing editing with dialogue. Dialogue can be one of the harder things to format right, to get the grammar and punctuation right. It's useful to go on Google and to find some blogs that have tips and tricks on formatting dialogue. But I've tried to highlight a few of the big issues that I tend to see. Any other comments, Reggie?
No, I think you've covered the main ones that I've come across anyway, like the main issues. Yeah, good work.
Then we're gonna wrap up this short little mini episode here, and we've got another full episode in the hopper coming soon. We're gonna talk about marketing, and we've also got some big news to announce, and that should, that new episode will be coming here shortly.
Very exciting news indeed.
And as always, if you have any specific questions on this topic, anything about dialogue that we haven't discussed, you can leave a comment here. You can look us up on Facebook, reach out, and we'll try to answer any off the cuff questions as best as we can.
Yeah, thanks very much for listening, everyone.
Yep, take care and see you next.